Well, good morning, Blue Troopers, and welcome to the show. By the time you guys see this, it'll probably be afternoon because I have had to do some research this morning to get the final touches on it, and this is fairly off the top of my head, though. So what I want to talk about, of course, is the first of the great air races, which, pardon my French, I will probably butcher this, but it is called the Grande Semaine d'Aviation de la Champagne. And it was the first great air race. It held in 1909, and it was a truly international event. Air races, as they were just getting started about this time, they just drew these magnificent crowds, and everybody is for everyone, from the ultra elite down to the common working man, because everyone had a fascination with it. I mean, aviation was only 6 years old. Most people had still never seen an airplane, and a lot of people were trying to promote aviation. One of them was Gordon Bennet Jr., who was from a publishing family of newspapers, and Bennet got the idea, let's have a race, because if there's one thing people will do when you give them anything that moves, one of the first things they'll start doing is racing it. I don't care if it's yachts, trains, planes, horses, kids on roller skates. You give a couple of kids something with wheels on it, and it's not going to be long before they're racing. It's just part of the human nature. And of course, this was a perfect fit. The brand new technology of aviation, and of course, racing. Something for everybody. And the first really international affair was going to be held in Reims, France. And Gordon Bennet understood that this is the perfect place to hold his race. So his race, the Gordon Bennet race, became one of the events. You see, the Grande Semaine was not a race, it was a series of races. Now, I'm not going to go into all the numbers and stats. Anyone can look that up, and this would be hours long if we were to try to cover all of that. I'm simply going to go into what the race was about and help you keep it straight. Now, there were 6 events, of which the Gordon Bennet was one. There was, of course, the Grand Prix de Champagne. This was for the longest flight without alighting or landing. And then there was the Prix de l'Altitude, for who could go the highest. There was the Prix des Passengers, who could carry the most passengers. There was the Prix du Tour des Pistes. This was for the fastest lap around the course. There was, of course, the Gordon Bennet Trophy, which was for the fastest 2 laps around the course, and that carried a $5,000 prize. That was no small prize. And then there was the Prix de la Vitesse, or Vitesse, which was for the fastest speed over 3 laps, and that carried a $4,000 prize. And that may seem a little backwards, but follow me on this. Given that these airplanes were doing a blistering 40 to 47 miles per hour, the wind alone could cause pretty substantial time differences on each lap. And when you started doing multiple laps, not only did you run the risk of engine failure or going wide on one lap, which could cost you a few seconds or something like that, but you also have to realize that the airplanes didn't really perform the same on any 2 given laps. As these airplanes would fly, they would burn a little bit of fuel. And of course, we kind of laughed at the small amount of fuel they were burning, but given the very nominal power they had, it didn't take more than a couple of pounds to start making a difference in your performance. So when you take into account things like the precision of the pilot, the shifting winds, the decreasing weight as you burn fuel, you started to get some small but noticeable differences in the times. So the average of 3 laps versus the average of 2 laps versus the fastest lap could be considerably different. I believe Blériot had the fastest lap at a blistering 47 miles per hour or so. But again, I don't want to get in the numbers. What I'm trying to point out is that a guy might fly 3 laps and win the race with a published time of 37 or 38 miles per hour, yet this very best lap he had may have been a good 10 miles an hour faster. So there was a lot of difference. And of course, the altitude, passenger carrying, and duration flights made sense. Now, all of these things together made up the entire race. And they were always battling the weather, and of course, in airplanes like this, a 10 or 15 mile per hour wind was a pretty serious thing. And they had some pretty bad weather that year, which caused a lot of problems. And you also had, obviously, the mechanical issues and everything. And the rules have been pretty well established, but some of them were left to interpretation. For example, the pilot, and I hope I'm saying this right, Lefebvre, was fined a whopping $4 for, are you ready for this charge? Recklessness and daring, because he landed his airplane right in front of the judges. That might make a t-shirt. Recklessness and daring, $4 fine. But these races did exactly what the founders of the races were hoping they would do. They popularized aviation, put it in the public mind, and because of the very generous prizes, they pushed people to start making advances in aviation very quickly. And as a result, by the time they held the 1910 races, the aircraft had virtually doubled in speed and power. I mean, of course, they're at the very early days when there was so much low-hanging fruit out there to be grabbed for improvement, and they did. And the motivations were the usual human motivations. Of course, there was the money and the prestige, but on top of everything else, there was just, this is what we want to do. We want to be the best. We want to be the fastest. And a great deal of national pride. The Americans were represented. The French were there. And one other thing that was a bit of a wake-up call for the world was that the 3 American-made Wright airplanes won the top 3 positions in the after the first day drew to a close. This was the 3-lap race. And Eugene Lefebvre was in top place. His 3 laps took 26 minutes, 42.6 seconds, with a fastest lap of 8 minutes, 58.8 seconds. I know I said I wouldn't get the numbers. I just wanted to give you an idea. Paul Tassander was in 3rd place in a Wright biplane, and Count de Lambert was in 3rd place, also in a Wright biplane. Then there was the Antoinette monoplane, the Voisin monoplane, the Farman. These were not all the aircraft that entered. These were the ones that finished. There were actually 11 entrants, and now getting back to what I was saying about how things could be radically different from day to day, I talked about Eugene Lefebvre. After the first day, he was, at the top of the leaderboard, as they would say on Dancing with the Stars. But when it came to the Grand Prix de Champagne, which was the longest time in the air without a lighting, he came in dead last. He only got 13 miles before he had trouble and had to land. The record was set by Henry Farman in a Voisin biplane, and he managed to fly 111.85 miles without landing. So that was the record back then. And the race was an extremely big deal. A lot of money was doled out, and of course, they'd accomplished pretty much all their goals. They had a lot of bad weather, and they had some crashes and stuff, but that was pretty much par for the day. Luckily, these old airplanes are so slow that often these crashes did a little more than break up the airplane. But the point I'm driving at about these early races is that they set the stage for what was to come. So the Grand Semaine was the truly first big to-do, which is kind of what that 1965 movie, Those Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines, was sort of patterned after, although it was supposed to be taking a year later, 1910, in a fictitious race. But just like in real life, in the movie, the race is promoted by a newspaper that's trying to sell newspapers. Everybody's chasing the prize, so on and so on and so forth. And the aviators were across the board, from the Germans who were government sponsored to the British officer who's since was pretty much, getting sponsored by the paper, to the Americans who were being hawked everything they owned to try and get into the race. I mean, this was all very true. There was very little government sponsorship of any kind back then. It was pretty much a bunch of guys doing what they could with what they had. And the Gordon Bennett Trophy, which was seen as, I believe, even though it was international, which by design, but I think it was seen as the American prize, was considered one of the big ones, even though it was just 2 laps. And it was really pushing all of the technology of the day. They had the one for altitude, they had the one for carrying people or weight, they had the one for distance, they had the ones for speed. So they were kind of covering all their bases. And because the promoters knew these were the things airplanes would have to do in the future, and it was another metric by which that they could create competition. And it did not take a lot of pushing for these people to jump on all of them. Now, the race would continue on for years afterwards. Of course, it would be interrupted by the First World War. And of course, the Gordon Bennett race and the Grand Semaine before and after World War I were very different animals because of the fast pace of aircraft development. But they continued to go on and on and on. But the Gordon Bennett didn't actually last that long. Bennet had said if any country wins the Gordon Bennett Trophy 3 times in a row, well, that'll terminate the race and it will retire the trophy to that country. They can maintain permanent possession. And in 1920, the French got their 3rd win in the Gordon Bennett, and that retired the trophy and the race. But there were plenty of other races, and there was the Pulitzer, and we'll talk about that later. But I just wanted to talk about the Grand Semaine and the Gordon Bennett and how this kicked everything off, and went from 1909 to 1920 with an interruption in the First World War. And the Gordon Bennett was retired in 1920 when the French got their 3rd win. So that's the first of the race series. So now you understand how the Grand Semaine and the Gordon Bennett really kicked off the whole air racing thing. But we're still going to be getting into the Schneider and the Pulitzer and all of these others, and they will also move through time. Now the Schneider Cup, being another big international air race, that one for seaplanes, would have the same rule as the Gordon Bennett. If any country won it 3 times in a row, that would end the race and they would retire the trophy. But that's down the road a ways. So I just thought we would talk about the first of the air races, the Grand Semaine and the Gordon Bennett, and that would make a good first installment for the video. And again, I didn't want to get off into the weeds on all of the numbers and people and everything. That anybody can look that up. I just wanted you to understand the atmosphere that was being created and where it happened. So the Grand Semaine in France is made up of 6 races, the Gordon Bennett being one of them, and many people thought perhaps the most important. And that would kick off air racing as we know it today, and the Gordon Bennett would go on until 1920 when the French would retire the trophy. And there you have it for today's episode of Max's Models and Air Racing and Coffee. Guys, you have a wonderful day, and off to do taxes. Model on.